Hello, my name is Clara Maveglia and I founded the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute in Berlin. My guest today is Professor Homann, the first professor of business ethics in Germany. Welcome to our community, Professor Homann. Guten Tag, Herr Professor Homann.
Hello, Professor Homann. Glad to see you. Would you like to introduce yourself? Yes, first of all, hello, and if I'm going to introduce myself, let's say this. I studied philosophy, my first degree, along with theology and German literature. And then, during the 1968 movement, I decided that we should also care a bit about society. So I began studying economics too, and it's this combination of philosophy and economics that makes you a specialist in business ethics, which is what I am. Okay, to be specific, you have the first chair in business and corporate ethics in Germany in 1990 at the Catholic University in Eichstätt, Ingolstadt. Why do we need business ethics? Business ethics is like any kind of ethics, and this applies to ethics ever since antiquity, Plato and Aristotle. It's a crisis phenomenon. And in 1990, following the 70s and 80s, when we had more and more scandals which had to do with ethics, Bhopal, Seveso, Sandoz, and so forth. And people thought at the time that with the help of ethics and morality we could avoid those crises. So there were increasing calls for business ethics, and this first chair was set up in Ingolstadt, Eichstätt, which I was appointed to. And around 2000, basically, I moved it to Munich, to the Ludwig Maximilian University. What's the good thing about being a professor? A professor, well, it's my lifetime mission. I can say and think what I like. I'm not affiliated to any party or any ideologies. I can say what I firmly believe. Of course, I have to substantiate that always with good reasons. What do you say about business ethics? What inspired you? Well, as I said, I'm a child of 1968. When my colleagues were all demonstrating on the street, I was taking my exams, and I wanted to totally change society, and preferably within a fortnight, but without understanding society and how it functioned. I was studying philosophy, as I say. So I said, that can't be it. And that's when I decided to take an additional course in economics, and it's that combination that made me a business ethics specialist. You might call it business philosophy, I don't know. That would be a bit broader. But that combination is, of course, traditional. Karl Marx was nothing but that. He had this combination of philosophy and economics. Or David Ricardo, Adam Smith, all those great names, they were always political economists. And it's this political, this addition, means that they were concerned with constitutional law and ethics and such matters. So let's stick with ethics. What is ethics? The way I use the word, which I suppose not everybody would, ethics is theory about morality. Parallel to physis, which is Greek for nature, and physics, which is the scientific theory about nature. Ethics is the scientific or academic theory about morality. And morality means this whole complex of norms, standards, principles that are supposed to give us guidance to behave morally. And if we don't do it, very often we should feel remorse, a bad conscience. That sounds like religion. Is there ethics without religion? That's a difficult question to answer. Let's look back at Greek antiquity and its philosophy. People still argue about whether philosophy is independent of religion or whether this is an amalgam of both. Philosophy really has fulfilled both functions in the pre-modern world, in ancient Greek philosophy. In Europe, this was essentially inherited by Christianity, closely linked with theology. But since the late Middle Ages, philosophy has emancipated itself, including ethics. And of course, once we have the Enlightenment in the 18th century, it becomes independent of religion. So Hegel, if you like, reformulated theology in the kind of categories used by secular sciences. Of course, it was a long process that took many centuries, but now morality and ethics can be completely separate from religion. Principles of the French Revolution, for example, liberty, equality, fraternity, these are ethical, political principles. They are formulated independently of religion, even though they derive from that tradition. They've been secularized. Why is the market economy an ethical system? Adam Smith thought that bakers do not bake rolls out of love for their neighbours. Yes, well, actually, that's the basic problem for anyone concerned with business ethics if you explore the market economy. How does this happen? Why must we today disconnect what people do from their intentions and moral motivations? Because if the butcher, brewer, baker produce their products out of self-interest, they're not doing it for moral motives or altruism or solidarity. We're appealing here to their self-interest. And then we have a rather strange constellation. Even in the tradition of modern thinking, starting with Kant, we tend to link our actions to our morals. I want to show solidarity. I want to do something moral. And this is an impact which has positive effects for other people. To some extent, objective altruism, but without a moral intuition and without a moral intention and without a moral emotion. And this is the challenge that we have to understand now in business ethics in our market economy. We have to be able to think in terms of morality which is disconnected from the motives, the moral motives we think we have in taking action. And we haven't really internalized this disconnect yet. There are lots of reasons for that, traditional reasons, psychological reasons, if you like. Quite happy to say something about that. It's the invisible hand, isn't it? The famous invisible hand. Do you want to say something about that? That's slightly different. The invisible hand is invisible within a regulatory system. Once we have a regulatory system, the function of the regulatory system is that those good results happen by themselves. But we don't create the regulatory system with the invisible hand. The formulation is in the discussion that we do that with the visible hand. It's the visible hand of law that enables us within the regulatory system to compete, and that then automatically, without anyone setting about to do it, actually now, in what they do, still produces good results. The positive of market economy is that since its introduction, the life of people has become better and longer. We have statistics to prove that. Can you endorse that? Yes, we can certainly endorse that right across the spectrum. We can see that very clearly in terms of economic history. Since 1820, our per capita income has multiplied by a factor of, I think, 70. Let me give you another figure which is currently in my mind. In the last 25 years, since about 1990, we have removed 1 billion people from absolute poverty through capitalism or market economy. In terms of academic terminology, those are the same thing, capitalism and market economy. That's never happened before in the world's history. 1 billion people. We have more than halved the number of people in absolute poverty in less than 25 years. But how does competition work? Competition works, to put it in simple terms, think of sport. One person makes a move and tries to be better than the other. Better with products, with knowledge, with services, whatever you like. And that puts the other one under pressure, of course. Competition is not a bowl of cherries. I make a distinction in terms of typology between two. Those who are weak in competition, who get left behind, have to make an effort in order not to fall out of the grid, not to become bankrupt in business. Now, you might think that the strong ones then will lean back on their laurels, but they don't, because you might be strong today, you might be market leader now, but you don't know whether tomorrow or the day after tomorrow you're going to be overtaken by your competitor because of new products or new services or automation or something else. So that means that the market leader, the strong one, has to also keep trying to get better. And this also applies to theoreticians, by the way. So why are companies important? Companies really have only existed for the last 200 or 250 years. And we define a company now as a production site where people work together without being a community of people who live together. That's the first new factor here, because in the Middle Ages, it was monetaries, for example, who did the work. Those were people who lived together. And there are two important abilities which they have, which other players don't. NGOs don't have this, and nor do politicians. Companies have, firstly, capital. NGOs don't have substantial capital, and if you look at states these days, the political states these days, all of them are basically, most of them, bankrupt, apart from maybe Switzerland. That's one thing. So they have capital. And secondly, they have the know-how they need to handle complex value chains efficiently. We're recording this in Berlin. How bad politicians are at organizing a complex value chain like an airport is quite obvious. Companies can do this. They've learnt to do this. Those are the two great skills that companies have. Now, I'm exaggerating a little. I'm going to cite the Bible here. Nowadays, it's the entrepreneur that clothes the naked and feeds the hungry. Without companies, we would not have this prosperity, this welfare. And that's why we continue to need companies. And of course, we need to think very carefully about, for all their shabby behavior, scandals, warts and all, this is experience of the last 2-3 years we've had with these terrible scandals in international companies whose names I will not mention. For all these deficits, we cannot dispense with companies. How would we manage these days with 7 billion people living on the planet, and soon it'll be 10 billion? How can we give them a chance to lead a successful or prosperous life? It's inconceivable. But market economy, capitalism, managers are being criticized on all sides. There are different reasons for that. Let's start with the external reasons. These are the deficits. There's an endless list, obviously. We could talk about that all evening. But that is not a reason for rejecting companies per se. You have to try to eliminate those errors. You don't reject hospitals and education because people have made errors. That only applies to companies. But none of the political parties in our republic want to abolish companies and the market economy. That's one thing. The second thing, and here we are striking deep into philosophical debate, companies, because of competition, are defined by the fact that they must make profit. They don't want to, they must. If they don't make profit, they disappear out of the market. They must make profit. And making profit, accumulating capital, for the last 2,500 years has been morally discredited. And if I can explain that briefly, I'd say in the pre-modern world we didn't have growth. To use the specialist terminology, we had the paradigm or the pattern of a zero-sum game, where someone could only be rich if they took something away from someone who was poor. In capitalism, that's not the case. It's a growth society. That means if the rich get richer, that doesn't mean they have to take it away from the poor. The wealth of the rich is based on better use of resources, especially knowledge. We have put knowledge to good account in new products, in medical technologies, for example, that have basically doubled our longevity in the last 50 years. These are all successes of capitalism. And we still run the risk, let's say, that when the rich get richer, and of course the media are full of these stories, that when the rich get richer, this happens at the expense of the poor, and that's not correct. The poor are pulled along too. We can only help developing countries if the rich get richer, if they do better. Because who's going to invest in developing countries, third world countries, if no one can expect a profit? Nobody. Altruism won't do it. But the profit-seeking nature of companies, if they have to invest, if they have to make profits, is not, which is what public discussion suggests, due to greed, that they can't get enough or whatever. That's the old way of thinking from the pre-modern world. Pleonexia, it is in Greece, always wanting to have more. Now, of course, there are people like that who always want to have more. If we look at the experiments that now play such a big role in business science, these greedy people, we'd say, account for about 20%, and the other 80% aren't greedy. So why do they also want to make profit? Simply because in competition you have to make profit if you want to survive. In Thomas Hobbes, at this point, it says, and perhaps this is very interesting because perhaps we should note this, he says, for the war of each against all, this is pure competition, the war of each against all, using all means, there are three reasons: glory, diffidence, and competition. The sequence is competition, diffidence, glory. So glory is wanting some kind of privilege or prestige, and competition is clear. But what's diffidence? 17 years later, Thomas Hobbes himself translated his text, Leviathan, into Latin. And how does he translate diffidence? Because in modern English, diffidence means something like lack of self-confidence. But he translated it as defense. And defense, self-defense, against your competition who are trying to get rid of me. So this profit-seeking of companies and also subjective agents, in most cases, is not down to greed, but to self-defense under competitive conditions. I have to constantly make an effort so that I do not fall out of the competitive system and become bankrupt. But that's one of the criticisms of capitalism, is that profit is the focus rather than people. But then you say people who express these criticisms, you're saying they don't understand how the market economy works. We need to distinguish between the motives people have for taking immediate action, but motivation is a problem in itself because companies aren't motivated. Really, all alarm bells should be ringing if companies start talking about motivation. Only natural persons can have motivation, but not an organization like a company with thousands of employees. Who's going to be motivated there? They have their own self-interest, but a company doesn't have a motive. So we have to distinguish between the interests of the company and on the one hand, and then the systems level. Market economy, capitalism, produces good results, and that's what its moral quality is founded on. The fact that it produces these good results for all people is based on the performance of the system, not the individual competitor. In the individual competitive action, there will always be losers, and that is the result, for example, of the turbulence in the political landscape, Brexit, Trump, and so forth. It's not only that, but these are the losers of globalization because of the increasing pace of industrialization and globalization, they're now digging their heels in and defending themselves, defensio à la Hobbes. They are digging their heels in to defend their living standards. So we have to draw that distinction. There is the interest that governs our immediate action, and there is the performance of the overall system. And the performance or the results of the overall system are what justifies capitalism, not individual behavior. There are losers. Okay, something completely different now, but this is important. Is it true that men and women approach business ethics differently? I think that's quite possible to the extent that I'm familiar with the findings and the statistics. It seems that women are more likely to be empathetic. It's just that I think, and that's why I would always recommend that a board or a working group should always be mixed, hybrid, so that all perspectives are present. Diversity is a big issue now in management theory. We do take care that diversity is adequately pursued. Not so people block each other, of course, because it's up then to the boss to make sure that teams are put together in such a way that this diversity is productive. That doesn't just mean men and women, it means different cultures and so forth. That's one thing. But the other thing is, the question for me is whether with women, in the long term, things will remain that way if they are subject to this tough competition. I would not lose sight of the pressures imposed by a system, and women can also fall under those wheels. If a company can't pay its bills anymore, they'll have to do all they need, they'll have to be tough, they'll have to sack people and so forth in order to save the company. You have to do it. So the constraints, the pressures from this competitive system are so great that I think women in the long term will not withstand it. Nevertheless, I would always argue that boards should be mixed, etc., not just boards, quite apart from the fact that women evidently are cleverer and do better in exams. In your opinion, what is the central problem of a modern business ethics? Well, of course, the problem is if we have competition and we are involved in competition, and let me mention Adam Smith and self-interest, not motivation, quite definitely not motivation, because you can't apply motivation to companies. For some years, I've been talking about a system imperative that forces me. So even the softies among us are forced to confront competition. And this competition, if you're talking about voluntary motives for certain actions in addition to that, if you want to generate advance, if you want to do something in advance of your competitors or do something more than your competitors, there's no room for that, because you'll always be giving the advantage to your competitors if you do that. So to be absolutely tough about this, the basic problem in a market economy where there is competition is that if you want to make an additional moral gesture, others will exploit it. Now, the problem of business ethics is to say, okay, so we have to establish a statutory framework here in such a way that people can still respond to their moral aspirations without permanently risking going bankrupt. I can't call upon a company to be permanently altruistic and moral and give away its products and go bankrupt, because that won't help anybody. And in the Western tradition, there is no ethical system that has required this. There is the old Roman principle, ultra posse nemo obligator, which means that nobody is forced to do more than they can. And companies can't do more than that. We cannot expect companies to do that. They cannot expose themselves to bankruptcy. Thomas Hobbes would say, when he talks about the war of each against all and the natural condition of humanity, that if there's anyone who wants to sit back and simply contemplate their life, they can't, because no one will let them do it. They depend on others. They would have to let him or her do it. And that's why we have our state of law, our rule of law. That's why we have a regulatory framework and laws, so that people are allowed to a certain extent to implement their moral aspirations. And this is the difficult thing that we haven't understood, that in a market economy, moral action that costs money, that causes additional costs, make us exploitable by our competition. And we need to have a response to that problem. And then I can't simply preach morality. I can only talk about conditional morality. It's conditional because if the regulatory system protects me from being permanently exploited by my less moral rivals who don't mind paying for corruption, who don't mind polluting the atmosphere, who don't mind manipulating the market and so forth, they will always get one over on me if they do this. So the system has to protect me with laws if I want to be more moral. And that has to be attached to tough penalties. Then we have a two-tier morality. We have on the one hand competition, which is where the moves take place, to quote games theory. But the moves are carried out within a statutory framework. So this invisible hand of the law prohibits certain things. So we have a two-tier morality here, which we have to bear in mind. We are governed in our actions by self-interest. But if we limit things, if we say fraud is impossible, corruption is impossible, market manipulation is impossible, pollution is impossible, and so forth, okay, the model is quite simple. We have it in sport. Look at football. The competition takes place on the pitch in the game, but within a system of rules, and there's a referee that makes sure the rules are observed. And then you can't do just anything you want. And then what happens is that the players out there on the pitch, in the heat of the battle, sometimes they forget themselves. But they hold back out of self-interest, because if they break these rules too often, they'll get a yellow card and then a red card. And that acts as a brake. It prevents them fouling too often. And it's the same thing in society. We need a regulatory system. We need an institutional system that can impose penalties and which the rule of law will ensure is executed. Remember the Euro crisis where that wasn't the case? The execution, the penalties that were provided for didn't happen. And then, only then, can I carry out this competition, resulting in this wonderful football match, or resulting in these good products, these good services for the market, and which is in harmony with moral, because then we have a system whereby morality, consideration for others, fairness, integrity, all of this is sorted out at the regulatory level, where we invent the rules of the game. And then I can do my productive competition within the regulatory system, and then I will get those advantages I mentioned. If we're talking about football, it is the case that the wages of the managers are criticised, but not the wages of the football players. Why that? Well, I have to say I don't understand that either. I can only see that in psychological terms, because the wages of the football players and the showmasters and so forth are paid for by ordinary people, and they pay because obviously they find pleasure in these matches. But of course it's the manager that is making sure that thousands of jobs are being maintained and has to make sure that those jobs will be preserved in the future too. And in my view, this is where this difficulty kicks in, that we don't understand that the market economy as a whole is a moral system. That's the purpose of the market economy, to make everyone's lives better. And we've been achieving that since 1820, since we've had the market economy and capitalism, and it's really taken off, as all the statistics show. We have an emotional attitude which is against the market economy and above all against competition. That's one point. And the second point is profit-seeking. Profit-seeking, which is merely a consequence of competition. That's one thing. Let's break that down now. Let's look at the psychological aspect. What about our personal socialization? How do we proceed there? Fundamental moral attitudes and intuitions and empathy, sympathy, solidarity are things we learn at the age of, the latest neuroscience says, brain science says, the first wave and the biggest wave where we learn most is the age of up to 3 years. And then there's another, well, there's a permanent growth, I suppose, but then there's another big wave in puberty. And let's say we leave puberty when we're 17 or 18. But at 17 or 18, we are still operating within a social environment governed by face-to-face relations, personal relations. These are small manageable groups. And there, my motivation plays a big role. I can see the direct link between the way I act, what I achieve, and my morality. I say I want to get my own back on someone or whatever. I can see the result. So we can connect our moral education with the results we get. Then we go out there into this big world, this anonymous big world with competition and profit-seeking, and then we no longer understand that competition is an instrument, means to achieve solidarity between all. In public discourse as well, we see competition as opposed to solidarity. No, in a market economy, if it's properly organized, if it's properly set up, competition is the means to achieving solidarity between all. The historical evidence of that is clear. The fact that that hasn't expanded right across the globe yet is another problem. If you like, I can say briefly something about that. It's very important here that if we are assessing this, we bear in mind the time frame within which these developments happen. In Europe, in the Western world, to establish ubiquitous market economy, democracy, human rights, and so forth, we have taken 800 years to date. In 2015, it was the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta and the inviolability of the individual. 800 years, with huge setbacks. Bear in mind the 30 Years' War in Europe and the two major catastrophes of the 20th century. Now, to some extent, we might not have quite got there, but we're fairly satisfied with this development as far as human rights, democracy, and the rule of law is concerned, although at the moment democracy is wobbling a bit. And if this market economy and competition as an instrument for solidarity, if we want to spread that around the world, and that's what we're doing through globalization, we still have this global. We don't have this regulatory system on a global scale, and we need to be patient. I'm sure we're going to need another 3 generations before we have this regulatory system applicable across the globe. So please, and here you can see, here too, there is a contradiction with our moral views that we are socialized to have. We want to see our results straight away. Not in 3 generations, no. And with this huge division of labour, it's not the case that we have one moral motivation applying to all. And we are not morally satisfied either, because we need to be morally satisfied. We'd like that warm moral glow that we've done something good. But how are you going to do that in a process based on a division of labour, which is going to take 3 generations to expand, where you are just a tiny cog in a wheel? And that's what the NGOs build on. They say they're going to support this child, and you get a photograph of that child, and you might even get a letter from that child or whoever's looking after that child to make you donate more. That's what they're doing. They're working on that personal face-to-face morality that you are used to, but you can't develop society on that basis. But there are still some open questions here. For example, who's going to define the rules? Well, in a democracy, it's us. Of course, not in a big popular assembly with 80 million Germans, for example, but through those that we mandate, who can do this better, who have a legal training, the politicians. And of course, we can punish them in elections and in public debate. But the kind of system that you're describing, isn't that based on egoism rather than on solidarity? If you want to call it egoism, I would say that because of competition, it's imposed egoism. The system imposes this egoism to avoid exploitability and enable people to defend themselves preventively against that exploitation. Remember, Thomas Hobbes, defensio, self-defense. The negative version is much more plausible than the positive version that people are somehow driven by greed. That's rubbish. Of course, there are a few people who are driven by greed, but basically that's complete nonsense that everyone's driven by greed. But they don't want to be exploited. Then they dig their heels in and defend themselves and protect their own benefits. In your system, then, what role is played by the moral of the individual in your system? Yes, okay. That's where the debate is at now, and we need to look at the detail. In my career, I developed the idea that this ordering morality, this ordering ethics is fundamental because it creates the conditions within which an individual can act. I like to say that there are 2 points in particular where we need individual morality. We need it, first of all, because moral intuition, empathy, solidarity are things we must learn. And we learn this, as I said, in that early age until we're 3, and then again during puberty when we get another episode. That is indispensable so that we have moral ideas to guide us, according to which we can set up these laws, this framework, these constitutions, and the detailed rules in the interests of all. So, to begin with, in order to establish those rules, and also to some extent at the end, these complex decisions which have to be taken now in the economy can't all be regulated. They can't all be covered by rules. Reality is always much more differentiated. But if you have a basis that systematically the exploitability of an individual company is prevented by and large, then those other decisions that have to be taken still can be left to individual morality without there being a danger that the company will be systematically exploited. So ultimately, the concrete decision about how I dismiss individuals, how I respond to my customers, and how I treat my suppliers, their morality can play a part again, and to some extent this is also rewarded, acknowledged by the general public, but also well-trained economists will reward it in the sense that people will seek employment in the more humane companies rather than the toughies. So morality becomes a production factor. Integrity becomes a production factor. There's no point in telling people at Volkswagen that anymore. I think they've learned. The billions that is ultimately going to cost them because of a lack of integrity and fraudulent behaviour on a wide scale. It's going to be very expensive for them. So morality has to become a production factor. And let's go back a step here to the philosophical foundations. In traditional thinking, this was inconceivable. Moral behaviour was correct behaviour which is in my interest but also in the interest of the other person. And that was always linked to my moral motivation. That was reinforced by Kant in the traditional interpretation or conventional interpretation of Kant. You can't think in that way any longer now. You have to think about the morality in terms of there not being immediate moral motivation. Someone who did understand that was Pope Benedict XVI in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate. We're talking about charity in truth, where he describes the idea that this regulatory policy, and I'm quoting him here, says the institutional path is, if you like, the political path of loving one's neighbour. Order is loving one's neighbour. And one of my students said, in fact, that order enables us to love those who are far away, not just our neighbours, because the good deeds through products and services and so forth benefit people we do not know a long way away in the world. So a broader concept of charity. This is practice charity, which applies not just to our neighbours but to all. Practice solidarity, but without a moral motivation at that point in time. And that is the point. And that's so difficult for us, because not just because of tradition, but because we are educated in these manageable groups, in these little groups, in the family and so forth, where this altruism, this emotional attachment to other people is so important. We can't do without that. But in modern big society, we have to apply other criteria. It works differently. And there it's about results for people. So if we're talking about the individual, a lot of people would ask, this great tax robbery in Germany, the biggest ever in history, these are human beings as well. Where was their motivation? Where was their solidarity? Where was their moral education? How was this able to happen? For 20 years they were doing it. We're talking about 31 billion euros in defrauded tax. Well, the question is how you want to allocate it. It is a scandal, but who is guilty? Who's to blame? The companies that did it are competing. One does it, the other doesn't. One rakes in the money, the other goes bankrupt. Or the people who don't join in are sacked. That's the problem. So they all do it. In the war of each against all, you have to defend yourself, says Hobbes, defensio. As far as I know, in the early 2000s, the finance ministry in Germany had its attention drawn to the fact that something was going wrong, and they took no action for 10 or 15 years. So if you want to blame somebody, then it's the political system, but not the economic system. The individual, anyone who doesn't join in this context, would simply fall out of the competition. So competition is a two-edged sword. It makes it harder to be moral, but at the same time, it is a moral enterprise in itself, because it has achieved fantastically good results for huge sections of the population. If we have to do competition, we have to make sure it has an adequate framework. You need both sides of the coin, and that didn't work because the political system didn't respond. So I wouldn't call that a market failure, I'd call that a political failure. You're talking about cum-ex and the cum-cum scandals. Okay, let's come on to a question which individuals ask themselves. Why are weapons sold to crisis areas? Industries make profit, and the consequence is that we have refugees come to our country because they cannot lead a successful life back home. Again, this is a political problem, not an economic problem in my eyes. The production of weapons is not in itself immoral. There are people who think, especially moralists, who think that if you don't produce weapons anymore, then peace would prevail worldwide. That is not true. As soon as you have one person delivering those weapons, let me remind you that Václav Havel, after the collapse of socialism, was attacked because Czechoslovakia, as it was then, was selling pistols and other small arms. And Václav Havel, the great moralizer among presidents, had to say, I think, what would you do if your state was bankrupt in competition? It's not making profit that's the problem. Making profit with businesses or trades that we don't want. The fact that we don't want them is something we have to resolve politically. We have to get rid of those crisis regions so that the consequences, the costs of crisis, the refugees, whatever, the human costs, we all know what they are, but we haven't yet found a way collectively to establish a regulatory system that ensures peace. For many years we did, until the collapse of socialism, and quite possibly 10 or 15 years after that. And what have we got now? 15 years ago, I could never have imagined what we have now. Ukraine, refugees, IS, whatever. But democracy, Europe, these are all big ideas, but of course they're based on growth and prosperity. But the planet's resources are limited, they're finite. Growth is defined by economists not only as material growth, more and more cars and so forth. That's rubbish, that wouldn't work. There's also qualitative growth. These are concepts. There's growth in, for example, care of the elderly and so forth. So growth, and also the concept of benefit in modern economics is much broader. It's not just about material goods. We're talking about living longer, quality of life, human relationships, cultural experiences, and so forth. All of this is covered by benefit in the broadest sense and by growth. But the problem is, of course, whether a democracy can be preserved in the long term without growth and without prosperity. And latest research, even on ancient societies and the economic history of, say, ancient Greece, show that even in the cradle of democracy in Greece, democracy did only function on the basis of a solid economic underlay. Let's turn that round. The big ideas must have an underlay of a viable economy. If that doesn't happen, if that economic underlay is misconstructed for this great idea of Europe, then the euro will collapse, you get a Greece crisis, and it was in that Greek crisis for the first time since the Second World War in Europe that real hatred emerged and became acceptable because the economic underlay had been wrongly constructed. You can't do morality if you don't, by and large, have that underlying economic viability. And that, of course, is an immediate counterposition to the standard interpretation of Immanuel Kant, who said, if morality is intertwined with incentives, with expectations of advantage, then it's not morality, then at most it's being clever. But it's not moral. That's how he's interpreted. And you can't expect people to do that. We saw that in the Greek crisis, how hatred emerges, how these great ideas were sold off because the economic underlay was misbuilt. So what can be done about this ethical perspective? I was an academic lecturer, and I always saw my task as teaching the future leaders and managers of our society the theory they need, first of all, to understand the structure of the problem, and then to see how we can rationally respond to that problem to the benefit of all. And if they are collective problems, you cannot resolve them with individual morality. You need collective problem solving, and that means political. You have to recognize the structure of the problem, and then you can respond to it. And that really calls upon us in our morality to learn. We have to discard this idea when we're talking about big society and global problems that we can solve that with individual morality. I'm quite happy to tell you my favourite story, which really sums up this whole morality problem in a nutshell. This is the story of St. Martin with my own additions. St. Martin lived in the 4th or 5th century, And as we know, it was a cold winter night and he met a beggar, freezing. So he took his sword, slashed it in two parts and gave half to the beggar. And this is still presented to us as a good example, like the Good Samaritan, of solidarity and concern for our fellow human beings. Now let me carry that story on. Probably they both died of cold because half a cloak wasn't enough. Now the theory, because St. Martin only shared the shortfall, he didn't do anything to prevent the shortfall. This is what capitalism, market economy does. To eliminate the shortfall, he would have had to build a cloak factory and give that beggar and other beggars their own cloaks and give them jobs there so they could pay for the cloaks. And what is the moral of the story? He probably would never have been made a saint. So you can see the whole problem summed up in a nutshell here, which we carry on our shoulders with our Western Christian tradition. Sharing solidarity is a very personal category where it makes a lot of sense, but we can't build societies on this basis and we cannot eliminate poverty with individual morality. You'll probably be aware that when you travel around developing countries, you are strictly told not to give alms to begging children, because that doesn't eliminate poverty, quite the reverse. It supports the poverty because they get used to the idea that they will get alms from tourists and can solve their problems in the short term, but sustainable it is not. The Catholic Church, you have to think about this. The Institute of Canonization and Beatification for people who set us particular good examples, they have never made a saint of an entrepreneur, certainly not a manager or a banker. Oh my God, no, it's inconceivable in our culture. Nevertheless, these are exemplary people because they do an enormous amount for the prosperity of humanity. Still not enough. We are halfway through the process, but we can only combat poverty through capitalism, through institutional regulation, not through development aid. The greatest progress in combating poverty, and this is empirical data, most of the progress in fighting poverty is made by countries that receive very little development aid. China and India, they've done it through capitalism, combated poverty, not through alms and development aid. You've given us a lot of useful information, but I do have a question for our followers, our users. What would you say to budding philosophers and politicians? What would you recommend? I would recommend, first of all, look very carefully at the structure of the problem. The fact that with collective action, there are two things to bear in mind. We always depend on others to join in. Under conditions of competition, an individual cannot behave morally if it's too expensive. They will be thrown out of the market. That structure of the problem has to be recognised. When Ms. Merkel, with the refugee crisis, she relied on the idea that her European colleagues would also express a willingness, because she thought it was a European problem, to contribute fairly to solving the problem. But Mr. Orban and others said, no, it's Ms. Merkel's problem, it's not mine. So this is an outsider position. You can't produce a collective response like that. Putin simply marched into the Crimea and relied on the idea that nobody would really seriously resist him. He took this outsider position. But you can't solve things that way. The structure of the problem needs to be recognized. And in theory, in science, we can come up with approaches for solutions, methods for solutions. And I would like politicians to understand those mechanisms. What are the conditions for applying morality if we want a world based on peace and liberty and solidarity and individual rights? You can't do solidarity if Germany has to take on Greek debt and if the Greeks rely on the fact that others will pay for their bad management and their corruption. So you have the same problem everywhere, that with collective action, and we have to respond collectively, and it could be very productively. Globalization is incredibly productive. With collective action, we will always see individuals taking outsider positions, and these are the free riders. They're quite happy to share in the advantages, but they do not make their contribution to the performance. And free riding is the real problem for all kinds of cooperation. Recently, evolution history, Tomasello, for example, he wrote a natural history of human morality in Germany and said, how has morality developed over 4,000 years, or from the period from 10,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago? The problem is how you deal with the free riders and knock them out. Otherwise you don't have cooperation. There are ways we can do it. The regulatory system is one way we can do it, with the sanctions that this independent referee has to impose. And then what results from that is that free riding is no longer worthwhile for the individual, because as long as it's worthwhile to free ride, there'll be people who do it, and we will not manage to get cooperation. People do not recognize the structure of this problem. Certainly not in philosophy. Very few people have recognized it. But there too, there's a risk, and I don't want to mention any names, that the free rider position is, they want to overcome it through moral positions by saying to people, don't free ride, be fair. But there's a problem there, because all the free riders will think, oh, but other people will carry on free riding, and I won't be there. It's, if you like, in games theory, it's the prisoner dilemma, but we're not going to go into that now. You can read about it if you want to. You can only resolve these problems with collective regulation with penalties applied. And if the sanctions, the penalties, don't work, for example, when Germany and France didn't meet the stability criteria in the early noughties without being penalised for it, that was the original sin for the euro, because everyone else thought, oh, I can do this too. This handed it to the Greeks on a plate. They said, we'll go there too then. I've got two more questions that I think are important to everyone. It's summer. Can we still travel to Turkey on holiday, or any dictatorship, or places where conditions are very unpleasant? What do you say? I would leave it to individuals. I have every respect for people who say, I'm not going there anymore. But you have to look to see what the consequences will be if we stop travelling there, for example to Turkey, because we've seen a drastic fall in the number of tourists going to Turkey. It's ambivalent, because you could say, one person could say, I'm going to go because I want to show that things need to change, and I'm going to go back there and I'm going to object and say what I think, and then I'm going to tell them that I won't be coming back next year. Or he might say, I'm going to carry on going there. Individuals have to decide that, how big their impact will be. But if an individual stops going, nothing will happen. That contribution will be negligible. But what can you do to ensure that no more Germans go to Turkey? Because the tourist data has fallen by 25%, I think. But how would you manage to achieve 60% not going? And will Erdogan learn anything from that if 60% stop coming? Maybe they'll be replaced by Russian tourists. So quite possibly it might be an inappropriate measure. But I have every respect for people who say, I simply can't face it anymore. I cannot go there in good conscience. People are saying that about America now. I can't go anymore. I can understand them. But whether that will resolve or change the social problem in any way, I very much doubt. Okay, the very last question. my savings, which I have scraped together over the years, how can I invest them? I don't know. I'm not a financial expert. I would ask my financial advisor, but I do know under what constraints and pressures, not motives, but pressures these financial advisors work. I know that on Friday afternoon, these people get called up by their boss and asked whether they've filled their diary with appointments for the next week, because banks earn money from permanently selling securities. So when there's fluctuation, they earn money. It's lucrative for them to make people buy and sell constantly. And they are explicitly told, you have not turned over your 4,000 euros for the bank this week. You haven't earned your money. I know this, and that's why I don't trust people like that. One possible answer would be an institutional answer and say, rely on the regulatory approach of the all-in fee, that you have a certain portfolio and maybe you have, 500,000, and you say 0.3% or 0.1% is automatically paid as a fee, but you don't pay for the individual transactions. Then you don't need this fluctuation. And secondly, the bank would have an interest in making the value of that 500,000 increase, because 0.1 or 0.3% of more than 500,000 is more than of 500,000, and the bank would earn by increasing your wealth, rather than them relying on this constant buying and selling. My savings, I know my bank manager is always phoning me up and suggesting I buy or sell something. I'm very skeptical because I'm aware of the interests, or let's say the pressures, that these advisors are under. I know very well how it works, so be careful. So what I've learned from this conversation is that you can't pass the buck, you can't pass the responsibility on. You need to stay informed, you need to keep your eyes open as an individual, and ethics doesn't mean that you can't simply pass all these questions on to another individual. You can pass a great deal on, but it depends on conditions that you as an individual cannot determine. We live with rule of law, democracy, with human rights, where quite a lot is stable. And then individuals do have responsibility for their decisions and need to think about these things. But if they want to be politically active, they need to take pains to understand the structure of the problem and the solutions that have been suggested so far. Ethics can no longer, not even the Pope these days, can determine individual details and say this is right and this is wrong. You call it casuistry in scholarship. There were thick books which told you exactly how to behave in every single scenario. Ethics doesn't do that anymore. Ethics just says there are certain principles we need to guide us, but we have our own responsibility for ourselves based on an assessment of our own situation, so that we can take our own decisions and stand up for our decisions to ourselves and to others. And it may be that 5 years later you would take your decision differently, but that too is perfectly acceptable, and the same applies to companies. So the principles, and this is where my business ethics comes in, I stick to those Western Christian principles. I'm not going to have anyone tell me any different, but conditions have changed. And when conditions change, you might get this sort of thing, that I say that competition expresses more solidarity than sharing, because when you share, the benefits are restricted to those I share with, but in competition, those good products will create benefits for an anonymous crowd. So competition displays greater solidarity than sharing. We haven't understood that yet, because we haven't understood this structure of the problem in our modern world. We haven't internalized it. It's not taught in schools, certainly not in the humanities. And there, I think we have the greatest problem. Now, I'm not going to get on the barricade for my solutions to problems, quite apart from the fact that there are a lot of problems I don't even have solutions for. But I certainly do go on the barricades for the structure of the problem, recognizing the structure of the problem. And we're still trying to tackle today's world with pre-modern structures or pre-modern principles. It's like trying to get round Vienna with a map of Hamburg. It doesn't work. Conclusion then, market economy and democracy are the best forms we have available to us today. I would say, yes, the best that we have discovered so far. That doesn't mean that we can't improve on it in the future. We'll have to wait and see what the future brings, and future generations. But these are the best systems we have to date. Of course, they have many shortfalls, many deficits, can be reformed. Like the Church always says, semper reformanda, we are always reformable. Thank you very much. That's been very inspiring for all of us. Thank you for your work and thank you for your time, Professor Homann. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation, as you noticed.